The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others, Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." Jesus asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not thinking as God does, but as humans do." Jesus called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "Whoever wants to be my follower, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. When Jesus asked his disciples, and therefore each one of us, "Who do you say that I am?" it's a common scriptural reference and it resonates with all of us. But other key questions arise that are demanded of us today in today's scriptures. What does it mean to believe in Jesus Christ, to have faith? What difference does being a Christian really make in my life? And in light of these scriptures, can I truly be identified as a follower of the Son of Man? The answers to these questions are given in the powerful spiritual truths presented in today's readings. From St. James in our second reading, "Faith, if it has no works, is dead." And in the Gospel, "Whoever wants to become my follower, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." And thirdly, Jesus says, "The Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." This third one is the great spiritual pattern. We call it the Paschal Mystery, the basic principle of what being a disciple means: to deny self, to take up your cross and follow Christ. Peter identifies Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, the Anointed One. The way of this Anointed One, the Christ, the Messiah, which all mean the exact same thing, is the path of God, is always the way of suffering love. We are his followers. The way to fullness of life is always through the path, and admittedly the dark path, of suffering. It is only after his rejection, after his suffering, his being put to death, that Jesus will rise again. So it goes in the spiritual order for each one of us. Every cross is followed by a resurrection for those who love God and act according to his purposes, to his will. The ego, the all-powerful I within each of us, wants glory and the path of least resistance. The ego wants wealth, privilege, prerogative, pleasure. This is what we want, but this is not the way of the Anointed One. This is not the way of the Christ, of the Messiah. The true path is always the way of ego reduction, of selflessness, the way of self-sacrificial love, the way of suffering love. Take up your cross and follow me. The kicker is, this will hurt, and this will hurt profoundly. The ego has to be put to death if it is to find this richer self of suffering love that Jesus modeled for us and that he calls us to live. It hurts to put anyone or anything else but ourselves first. We may deny that, but if we truly dig deep in our heart, we know how difficult this is. This is a great truth, but a very difficult one. My ego, each of our egos, has to find what we experience as the dark path of self-denial if we are to come to richer life. Jesus says he will undergo great suffering. He'll be rejected and killed, and then after 3 days he will rise. Once we leave the path of ego, the path of self-aggrandizement, then we are free, truly free to transform the selfishness of others through our compassion for them, precisely by bearing their aggression, their ego, with patience and compassion, in imitation of Jesus himself. This gospel that we just heard sits at the fulcrum of Mark's gospel. Everything before has been great, stunning miracles and great teaching. Everything after this gospel points to his suffering, his death, and his resurrection. It points to the place where Jesus is about to go. He says he's going up to Jerusalem, to the place of opposition, the place of resistance. To destroy the people of Jerusalem? Absolutely not. He could, but no. To transform their aggression by his example, by his compassion. Despite everything the Bible tells us about the suffering of truly righteous people, we, his followers, frequently think that if we pray enough, God will remove all trials from our lives. But our lived experience knows that is just not true. For example, a family, say, with a drug-addicted son or daughter, might be pressured to pray harder and he or she will come around, rather than to pray for the strength to care for their child and to find the right treatment and support, to find the path of self-suffering love. Such devout Christians have grasped the Jesus of the miracles, but have ignored the Jesus of the cross. Prayer is important in our healing, of course, but prayer is an opening up of ourselves to God's will in our lives, not in an exercise in forcing God to do our will. As he said in the Garden of Gethsemane, "Father, take this cup away, but not my will, but thy will be done." It is the basic pattern for all our prayer. And what was the answer to that prayer of Jesus in the garden? The Father's answer was no. You must suffer. We must model suffering love to the world so that they know who we are. Once we find that freedom individually, we learn to walk the dark path of suffering love. And then we can help others find that same path. Jesus doesn't want to destroy the chief priests, the scribes, the elders. He wants to change them, to transform them by the power of his own life, by the example of his own life. But then Peter speaks up in the gospel. He rebukes Jesus. We should all imaginatively move into the space of Peter. I think we all can relate to him. Whether we know it or not, we are often in the position of rebuking the Lord. Anytime our ego, our selfishness rules, we are in fact Peter rebuking the Lord anytime we sin. Peter saw the messiahship of Jesus as just one more opportunity for the ego. I am with the Messiah, with the Christ, with the Anointed One. That means attention, popularity, power, honor, privilege. Peter can't understand when Jesus says he is going to be rejected, that he's going to be killed, and thus he rebukes the Lord. Our sinful egos, my sinful ego, yours, often rebuke him as well. My way, Lord, not your way. My way, Lord, not the cross, not your way. In Mark's gospel, the temptation of Jesus is defined in Peter's rebuke. Jesus is tempted, and so are each one of we in Peter's statement, to think that God's anointed can avoid suffering, can avoid rejection and death, that God's rule means power without pain, glory without humiliation. This is Peter's human way of thinking. And Jesus, overcoming this tempting suggestion, identifies it as a devil of an idea. Get behind me, Satan, he says to Peter. Jesus turns the tables. He rebukes Peter and me and all of us by reminding Peter and me and all of us, you are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. Jesus' rebuke reminds Peter where disciples belong. Behind me, he says. Get behind me and follow after me. Disciples are not to guide, not to protect or possess Jesus. They are to follow him, to follow his suffering love, to follow his example. The flow of this gospel has moved from who is Jesus, who do we say he is, through what does the Christ really mean, and turns now to what does being a disciple mean. Jesus says, you are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. That's the core of this passage. Jesus is inviting them and each one of us into a whole new way of thinking. The path to life is a path of suffering love, of self-denial, of bearing the burden of the other. That's the path to life, of seeing others as God sees them. I think those among us who have been married for a good long time know this suffering love best. Sacrifice is difficult, and for a good marriage, you all know it must be there. Only love eases that sacrifice, and perfect love can make it a joy. We are willing to give in the proportion that we are willing to love. As the quote from St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, which is written under the beautiful crucifixion scene here at the Cathedral, says, Christ loved me and delivered himself up for me. Out of the great love that he had for us, he could live that suffering love for us. The path of suffering love is the path that leads to resurrection. Modeled by Jesus, the path of suffering love is true for each one of us in our daily lives. This suffering love is what we celebrate when we gather here at each and every Mass. We gather in intimacy with the One, the Anointed One, the Christ. We know who He is, the Holy One of God. Here in the Eucharist, we witness the representation of His saving death, of His suffering love. That is what the Eucharist is, making present again the cross and death of Jesus Christ, that we know is the way of the one whom we follow. Here at this Mass, in Holy Communion, we receive the one who is suffering love, so that hopefully we can better be that suffering love when we go from here back out into the world. The Scriptures present us with a great challenge today. I have to get out of the way. My ego has to be reduced. It's true for all of us. The suffering love we receive in Holy Communion is fruitless if we come here and it doesn't transform us into suffering love. That is the goal. We have to work at it in our prayer, in our celebration of the sacraments, in our daily activities with whom we meet. As St. James said in our second reading, faith without that follow-up action, faith without works, is dead. This is why at every single Mass, at the end of Mass, you are exhorted, go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your lives. We take the suffering love that we have received here, and in imitation of Him, we take that so that we are transformed into suffering love, so that we can be witnesses of that to the world we encounter.